Hey, what is up, guys? Javier Guadalupe here, back with another episode of the Javier Experience. This episode is sponsored by Sprite. Sprite, obey your thirst. Please go buy Sprite, or I won't be able to feed my kids. On this episode, we're going to take a look at the book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. Now, if you haven't read the book, let me bring you up to speed. A journalist named Rebecca Skloot recounts learning about an African-American woman named Henrietta Lacks, who died in 1951 of cervical cancer, but whose cancerous cells became the first immortal human cell line called HeLa cells. Rebecca explains that HeLa made possible some of the most important discoveries of the 21st century, but that we know little about the woman behind them. But we're gathered here today to discuss an interesting topic related to the book: mid-20th century healthcare and related economics. During Henrietta's early years, the 1920s, the United States had 3 Republican presidents in a row: Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and then Herbert Hoover. This means that healthcare laws and regulations leaned more to the right, and there was no strong effort for change. Growing cultural influences of the medical profession led to physician incomes to rise, and rural healthcare facilities were labeled inadequate. Companies were beginning to merge with life insurance companies. For example, General Motors signed a contract with Metropolitan Life to insure 180,000 workers. Even penicillin is discovered, but it will be 20 years before it's used. In the 1930s, a Democrat finally reaches office, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now we've entered something known as the Progressive Era. In the Progressive Era, reformers were working to improve social conditions for the working class. However, unlike European countries, there was not a powerful working class support for broad social insurance in the U.S. The Labor and Socialist parties' support for health insurance or sickness funds and benefit programs were much more fragmented than in Europe. Therefore, the first proposals for health insurance in the U.S. did not come into political debate under anti-socialist sponsorship as they had in Europe. At the start of the 1950s, national healthcare expenditures are at 4.5% of the gross national product. However, attention was turned onto Korea and away from health reform. America had a system of private insurance for those who can afford it and welfare services for the poor. Federal responsibility for the sick poor is firmly established. Many legislative proposals are made for different approaches to hospital insurance, but none succeeded. Many more medications are available now to treat a range of diseases, including infections, glaucoma, and arthritis, and new vaccines become available that prevent dreaded childhood diseases, including polio. The first successful organ transplant is performed. The U.S. healthcare system is unique among advanced industrialized countries, as we've gone over. The U.S. does not have a uniform health system, has no universal healthcare coverage, and has only recently enacted legislation mandating healthcare coverage for almost everyone. Rather than operating a national health service, a single-payer national healthcare insurance system, or a multi-payer universal health insurance fund, the U.S. healthcare system can best be described as a hybrid system. In 2014, 48% of U.S. healthcare spending came from private funds, with 28% coming from households and 20% coming from private businesses. The federal government accounted for 28% of spending, while state and local governments accounted for 17%. Most healthcare, even if publicly financed, is delivered privately. Now, I know we've kind of deviated from 20th century healthcare, but trying to understand 21st century healthcare can really show you the progression of the system in America. So in 2014, 283.2 million people in the U.S., 89.6% of the U.S. population, had some type of healthcare insurance, with 66% of workers covered by a private health insurance plan. Among the insured, 115.4 million people, 36.5% of the U.S. population, received coverage through the U.S. government in 2014 through Medicare, Medicaid, and/or Veterans Administration or other military care. In 2014, nearly 32.9 million people in the U.S. had no health insurance. Now, as you can see, the healthcare system in America is completely crazy. I wouldn't even call it a system at this point. It's been debated and changed so many times, and we're still behind other industrialized countries. But even going into a topic like race and healthcare is a whole separate can of worms. But I think that's enough time for this episode of, what I call this? Oh, the Javier Experience. And remember, this episode is brought to you by Sprite. Sprite, obey your thirst. Use code POPPY for your discount of 10% on the next bottle of Sprite, and that is all for today. Gosh, I suck. Since then, the healthcare system in the United States has been debated and changed dramatically. Anyway, even going into race and healthcare is a whole other can of worms. And I think that's enough for this episode of The Javier Experience. Now remember, this episode is brought to you by Sprite. Obey your thirst. Use code POPPY for 10% off your next bottle of Sprite, and that is all for today.